Hello and welcome back. We're going to start today with assessment. Assessment's the most common question we get at portals, and there's a reason for that. And we understand the reason, but we want at least to walk you through the philosophy of assessment. Assessment simply means gathering evidence of learning. It's always meant that. Assessment's not the same thing as grading. Grading's a set of practices that are attempting to represent learning largely to parents, but also to a government school system that's trying to sort kids. In portals, assessment can happen naturally throughout the lesson, but grading doesn't. And we'll look at each part of the lesson in this session and suggest a variety of assessment tools for you that you can put together in any arrangement you want in order to do grading. If you need to report to parents, parents want to know how their kids are doing, and that's okay. Now, in government schools, assessment often gets mixed into the grading process, a number of measures that actually have nothing to do with learning. For instance, attendance, effort, turn-in rates. These are all measures of the child in one way or the other, but whether or not they attend the class or not isn't an actual measure of learning. Neither is effort. Some students learn things effortlessly, but they are learning. And some students have to work very, very hard and maybe in the end don't actually comprehend the content. Turn-in rates likewise don't actually measure learning. They just measure, organizational skills. So as those get mixed in, just understand that when you're designing your classroom, when you're putting together your learning environment for your kids, ask yourself, what am I actually trying to measure? And if attendance and organization are things you want to measure, those would be part of your grading system. You'd simply keep a tally or a graph book or a grade book, put the student's name off in the left column, and then start adding things each day that would fit into the various aspects of how you want to put your grade together. Frankly, this is what government school teachers do also. When you come to a portals lesson, there are three different parts: read, think, do. You've already seen that. Let's look at each one and ways in which you can tally or assess or keep a measure of student performance, but even more importantly, student learning as you go through the year. You can follow the text in the reading section and notice comprehension of the text, main ideas that are captured, and recognizing important details. So as you do each reading every day, the fact that the child has either heard the reading aloud, or they've read it aloud on their own, or they've read it quietly in their head is something you can record. Out of 144 lessons, how many of the 144 of the readings have actually been completed? And so that simple tally alone can give you a completion measure as part of your class. You can also do annual reading assessments to measure reading growth with a norm reference test. At Portals, we recommend the California Achievement Test, or the CAT test, because you don't need to be a licensed administrator to administer that test. Yet at the same time, it provides an annual measure of where your students' reading scores are at. This too can be shared with your parents. When you show your parents that the reading scores are gaining at incredible rates, that's an exciting thing to be able to share. And the same thing's true even if they're not gaining reading comprehension and proficiency quickly. You know that you have some needs there, and you might actually want to have that child evaluated for dyslexia or other reading disorders. You can also do subjective evaluations. Don't forget, this is part of grading in almost every classroom. At what point or to what degree or what character is being displayed by the child when they approach reading? These can be indicators too. If the child resists reading, again, you might have some kind of learning disorder that you need to address or have evaluated. But you can subjectively just say, yeah, they're actively in the reading, they enjoy it, they're quiet while they read, they exhibit these character traits, and you can share all of those things with parents at your next parent meeting. During the think session, you listen to the narration and the conversation as a teacher that you're having with each child. And you can do this even in larger classrooms. After the reading's over and the students start working on their projects, you can take a knee next to their desk and have 2 and 3 minute conversations with every student in your class every day. So the ongoing conversation that you have with a child throughout the year will show growth, and there will be things to measure there. The student can explain, connect, compare, question, and support ideas that were in the readings, and you're going to see growth in those areas, or at least you should. Portals does not provide answer keys for the think questions. There's a reason for that. The conversation is ideal on its own. As soon as you add grading to the think questions, then the student's concern and their answers will be altered based on what they think you want to hear. So having the pressure of a grading rubric or a correct answer to a subjective question is a mismatch of an assessment tool and the actual action. If the teacher isn't aware of the reading, or they feel like they don't know how to answer those questions because they haven't participated in the reading in any way, that sends a pretty strong message to the child. If it's not important enough for you to read ahead or read with them, let's be honest, if you don't care, why should the student? So for these reasons, we don't provide answer keys. We want an actual conversation, and those conversations can take a number of different directions. That said, there are still ways to assess the think. Some teachers use the think questions as written response tools, so they actually have the students write their responses. Now, if you're in a larger classroom, this can be effective because you can read through responses later on your own time. But they're not necessarily quizzes. In this case, the writing itself would be something that you could measure. Is the student using good grammar? Are they using complete sentences? And you can actually turn the think section of any class into a small little grammar class. You can still assess the conversation later in your notes, also keeping your own record. Medical doctors do this all the time. They'll keep a record of every conversation they have with you, but they'll often take those notes immediately after your visit to the clinic. You can do the same thing. Even with a small little notebook in your hand, you can take quick, fast little tallied notes around every conversation you have. For instance, you might create your own color-coded or graphed system of where a student was at on a given day. And again, there's 144 lessons, meaning you have usually 300 plus questions, and you can simply use percentages of those for some kind of measure. One way you might want to measure a conversation is, was the conversation inadequate or showing misunderstandings in the reading? The next level up would be, well, that was an acceptable conversation. They understood the reading. The third measure might be, actually, it was not only understood, but the way it was communicated was clear and direct and practiced. The students gaining communication skills. And then you might have a fourth level that just says, that was a robust conversation. The student introduced new and unique ideas from the reading. They're actually thinking about the reading. So when you look at the think column, you can measure those things, keep a tally of those things, but I want you to consider not grading them. If you're going to grade anything, grade the communication skill, but don't grade the answers, because students should have the ability to read something and have an opinion about it, just like you do when you read a book. During the do section of the lesson, you have lots to observe and lots that you can assess. Can the student use the skill? Can they solve the problem? Can they create the thing? Can they complete the process? Can they innovate? Can they make up steps and figure out a larger project by creating a plan? All of these are not just evidence of learning, but they're evidence of life skills. And they appear all over the place. You will have conversations about the project with your children. Those conversations, the projects themselves, any writing or description of the project that you may have the students do before or after the project, demonstrations and public presentations of the project. Portfolios can be gathered throughout an entire year where students gather and collect their own set of examples to show that they are mastering a subject area or growing in their learning. You don't need to put a letter grade or a number grade on any of these things. That's grading. But you should, as a teacher, be assessing. Is the student growing? Are they developing? And again, you keep your notes on that so that you can share with the parent the progress of the child. Grades can actually compress performance into a number and a letter, and that feels convenient. It feels like something's been done, but it's not necessarily a measure of the many different aspects that are occurring when you do a project. So especially for older students, you're looking for projects to actually evolve or develop into professional interests, career skills, lifetime hobbies. How do you grade that? How do you measure that? So a grade is not the same thing as understanding. It's also not necessarily capturing what you're looking for in the do column. And your relationship with the child gives you better information. The more you talk as they're doing the project and after they finish it, the more you're going to know about the child. That can be captured, assessed, and shared back with parents. You know whether the child is guessing, if they're struggling, and even struggle isn't a bad thing. If the struggle is towards innovation, then we want them to make mistakes and learn and grow. You could actually grade the number of edits or revisions or changes of plan that happen during a project. And if you value those things and you see them as a path towards innovation and development of the child, those are things you can report back to the child. Did they persist even when they struggled? Is there work ethic and hard work? Are they using other ideas just to copy and make a shortcut? Or are they innovating based on other ideas that are out in the world? Are they explaining things well? Have they made final understandings or learned things through the process of the project? All of these things can be documented and shared back with parents. But again, you need to have a grade book or a notebook or some place to capture those assessments. Another way to assess projects is looking year over year. I mentioned portfolios. This is where that becomes very useful. You will see over time that various projects will develop and evolve. So you may do multiple cook-bake projects throughout a school year, but you'll also see cook-bake appear from K through 12. So you could assess, even as its own independent class, is this child developing skills at cooking and baking? And so all of the project categories can be treated that way. They can be treated as their own subject area, and you can assess or give feedback to the parent as to how they're doing on their computer tech skills, how they're doing in physical activity, if they're developing in a heart for ministry. So every time you do a project, you can ask one or two simple questions. And this is how you might have an assessment conversation with a child around a project. What did you learn? Was it difficult or easy? What can you explain or do to another person that was about to start the same project? What tips would you give them? What questions do you still have? And if you were to do this project all over again, what would you do next time? So we've brought up some of these questions before, but they help students reflect and they help you plan. And you need to know these questions just to be able to pull them out at any time, because you don't know when that conversation is going to be available. When a misunderstanding appears in a project, treat that as information for you to assess with, not condemnation of the child. And decide whether or not you should clarify that immediately or if you should let them struggle and figure it out for themselves. Provide practice, change the approach, revisit the concept. All of these are options that you have during a project. Assessment or good quality teacher assessment will help you make those decisions. Mastery often includes mistakes. So we don't average, or if you're going to try to do some kind of grading system around projects, be very careful to have the early failures be part of a permanent grade. Because if you want to assess learning, you should assess where they're at the end of the process. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. Would you grade a child on the percentage of times they tipped, or would you grade them based on the fact that at the end of the learning process, they're able to ride a bicycle? So we allow practice until balance shows up. Academic learning is no different. We allow practice so that mastery can appear. Some people call this mastery assessment. That comes with some baggage, as we tried a lot of that in the 80s. We actually do want students to learn, and we have expectations that they'll learn, but we're also realistic about how we do assessment and how we do grading and the difference between the two and what our goals actually are. If I want my child to show good character, I actually want them to be in situations where they might make mistakes, because I want them to learn how to pick themselves up. And that's an important part of the learning process, especially in the younger years. As they get older, I want to see that they know how to involve other people. What a government school might call cheating, I would call collaboration. So there might be situations where you actually want students to work together, learn from each other, get new ideas from each other, and help each other with projects that they're struggling with. Those skills are essential in life, and I want to see them start to appear. So I can assess anything and everything, but I also want to be strategic about what I assess, because what I assess is determining and putting on display value to the child. Whatever you grade, the child will understand that's what you value. So grade the right things, assess the right things, keep a good record book, and share back with parents what you're seeing as a teacher every day. Assessment should help you make wise decisions, and it should help students recognize their own growth around the values that you share. Okay, so some of you might now be thinking, that's way too loosey-goosey. I can't do that. Just show me the rubric. Tell me how to assess. Show me the grade. And I'm going to push back on that just a little bit, but hear me out. If I were to use a rubric, let's say you have high performing, performing, satisfactory, and underperforming as your 4 columns on the rubric. And in each column, you as a teacher carefully detail what you expect to see in every one of those areas. Now you give the assignment to the student and they read the rubric. They will at that point turn off all their thinking. They're only trying to figure out what you want from them to get a letter grade. At that point, you've already lost in the learning equation. Rubrics are about 25 years old. They didn't really exist before a fad where they thought that was a more robust form of grading, but it's still grading. And the problem with grading is this: the student will do, as to the best of their ability, they'll do everything on the checklist to get the A, especially if they're highly concerned. But all they've learned how to do is follow your directions. And there's a place for that in the learning environment, but the overuse of that environment makes it so the child never thinks for themselves. They never imagine and they never create, because in doing that, they get punished because they're ignoring the rubric. And so the training that starts to follow is a child that doesn't know how to think. They don't know how to lead. They don't know how to innovate. They would never and can't change or deter from whatever system you set up. So be very careful when you design a rubric and how you can do it. We can show you how to build the rubric. You simply outline and make very clear to the child what you expect for each of the columns that you have. It takes time to build that rubric. It narrows the learning and innovation when you do it. And it takes time then to do that actual hands-on grading and assessment with which you may or may not agree with the child on how you assessed it. And so you have a number of parent meetings where it's just contesting systems that the teacher set up. If you back off from that a second, think of the time that you save. Think of the unnecessarily constraining of that project that you can remove yourself from, and the follow-up conversations and assessment and grading that takes more time for the teacher. How about an alternative? You simply have a conversation with the student that takes 1 to 2 minutes after they're done with the project. Then you go back to your notebook and you record. I was happy with the conversation. I have determined that this child has learned. And at the end of the day, using a rubric, a grading system, a percentage system, a letter grade system, or a conversational system, at the end of the day, the teacher still makes a subjective assessment of learning. The only exception to this might be in a skill area, where you do a norm referenced mathematics test and you get a percentage or correction right, you know where they're at. A reading test will do the same thing. Those are carefully designed, scientifically honed tests and assessments. But you don't need to use those every single day, and they don't need to be a measure of a year's worth of growth of a student. So be careful with rubrics, be careful with grading systems. On the other hand, if you still want to use them, it's your classroom and you're free to use them, but understand what you're using has power and it sends a message to the student over time. Common mistakes to avoid, we get to cover next. This is fun. I get the chance to go out and meet a lot of you at conferences, and my wife and I get to chat with you about this. So we get a ton of questions that come back, especially those returning to portals and struggles that we've seen. We also, through the hub support, we document what are the nature of the phone calls we get on the hub support. What I want to do in this session is try to summarize some of the common mistakes, some of the things that people run into, and hopefully help you to avoid them so that you can have a successful year. So let's dig in. As you begin using portals, there are some common mistakes worth avoiding. And we can say this, we can put it in the hub support, we can throw it in the emails, but really a lot of times I think sometimes people just bump into this. So the first one is this: don't try to complete every possible thing that's in the lesson plan. We're pretty careful to give you a lesson plan that doesn't overwhelm, that doesn't have 7 options or 8 options, but you may see 2 options in a do column. You may see 2 or 3 additional videos in the reading column. And we try to add in elements so that you as a teacher don't have to go searching and finding those on your own. We want to save you time. So Portals offers resources and ideas to you as a teacher so that you have useful and manageable choices to make as a teacher, but the choices aren't a checklist, and they're not meant to create pressure like I have to get through all of these things in one lesson period or one session. Select what best serves the lesson and your learners. So we often put the text reading first in the read column. So if you can read that your class is interested and they're into it, there might be a couple additional things to add. If they're not into it, you may just want to move on to the next class. Second mistake, allowing the reading to become something like page completion. And this is like trying to just get through readings is undervaluing the readings, and that sends a message to the student. So when you read aloud, pause for narration, clarification. If you run into a vocabulary word that you don't think the kids might know, stop the reading and actually have those conversations with students as you go. Whenever you stop or pause in a reading, you're adding that breathing moment for kids to absorb what's been read, but they're also watching how you react to the reading, and that's healthy and it's good. People make the mistake that they're just trying to turn pages. That's not the point of the reading section, especially at younger agers. You want to show them how you respond to text and reading. So getting to less reading in a day, but having a more robust time with it is always better than just flipping pages to get through content. Another mistake in Portals we see is trying to answer questions for the student or come up with right answers in the think section. We've talked about this already a little bit. Give people time to think. Even, you know what, get a night's sleep on that and I'll ask you again tomorrow. When students answer questions, try to ask them, where did you get that evidence from? Where in the reading did you pull that from? So that they know that often when you have conversations, you're not going to answer the question for them, but you will ask them to reinforce what they are saying. This is a practice for lifetime learning. Letting people wrestle with things is a worthwhile problem, and it really does show them you're not there to do the work for them. You're there to help them and to get through the work. So productive struggle is part of the learning. The next mistake that people make is right on top of that, not recognizing true frustration. So where struggle is good, frustration is bad. Struggle actually engages the learning process, but when a kid gets to a point where they've just hit a brick wall, you as a teacher need to step in and take a pause, take a break, relax. If you have a student that hates a particular subject area, you just pulled them out of government schools and they hate it, well then reduce the number of subject areas until that love of learning starts to reappear. Yes, they have to get through chemistry at some point, or do they? Depending on your state's requirements, there may be entire subject areas where you just say, look, this isn't part of this person's passion. It's not their life. It's like pulling teeth to do it every day. Know that as a teacher, you have some decisions to make. Now, in a school setting, you may not have that flexibility, but you do know what frustration looks like, and you can recognize it. Instead of requiring an IEP or various acronyms and things like that, know the student and understand what they're capable of and what struggle looks like versus frustration. Another mistake happens over in the do column, kind of similar to trying to answer questions for the students and think as though you need to do that. The fourth mistake, or the fifth mistake, would be to take over projects and start doing it for them and telling them how to do it. Your adult skill can quickly improve if you do projects, but their child skill may not improve as fast as yours. They may not understand a process as quickly as you do. So the simple appearance of a project and a little bit of pause on the kid's part may be okay. Offer guidance, make sure they're safe, make sure they have support and supplies, but keep the student responsible for the thinking part of the project and the creating part. Another mistake is to expect identical work from every age. We don't see this a lot because it seems like common sense, but obviously your younger kids and your older kids will complete a project, even the same project, with different levels of ability. This is okay. Multi-age learning kind of depends on this experience. So If you have, say, a kindergartner, first grader, second grader, and we call them founders, your kindergartners will not perform at the same level as the second graders. That doesn't mean they're deficient, incapable, or that they're missing out. It does give them an entire year of school to recognize there's room to grow, there's things to learn. And so, where the younger kid, the kindergartner, the third grader, the sixth grader, may be more immature, may have less attention span, they also see that those things are part of what's coming. In addition, the older kids, though they're performing better, doing better, learn how to share that with younger kids, and they can become and practice service and leadership skills. So don't expect the same product from every age. Don't expect them to do all the same things. And don't expect them to be at the same level, either with the reading, the thinking, or the doing. Understand the developmental growth of that child and assess accordingly. Another mistake is to treat 40 minutes as an absolute or a limit. Now, in school settings, some of you have bell schedules. You actually have hard minute counts that you have to live within. However, how you use your time within that bell schedule does protect a few things. It protects the learning in your classroom and your sanity. So knowing that you can make changes, that you can flex when you need to, that if you don't finish a lesson today, we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow. And you can move through the school year not being obligated to complete every one of the 144 lessons. Sometimes my box checkers, that's a that's a terrifying idea for you. But think of it this way: when you went through school, I don't remember 1 year when we finished the history book. We got as far as we could get within 180 days of a school year, and you're in the same way. If you have a 4-day week and you do 144 days, or a 5-day week with 180 days, there might be a number of classes you don't actually finish all the lessons. Don't be locked down by that, but understand that it's better to move flexibly with your students than to be rigid. Another mistake is if we've actually had these, this is, I think, kind of funny. You may have a better idea for a project than what we have in the lesson plan. In fact, you know your kids, you know your environment, you know what's in your supply closet. You look at our project idea and you're like, I need to adapt that or change it. And this is the right way to do it because Portals wrote it that way, but I want to do it this way. Hear this very clearly. Changing a lesson to match the needs of your environment and your students, that is the Portals model. What you have here are suggestions for your lesson plan and hopefully a great set of tools to where you always have great ideas. But I think God's going to give you good ideas too. In fact, they might be better. They might be so good that you want to use the note to Portals and let us know what you did instead. And then our lesson planners will look at those and they might even add them to the lesson. So avoid measuring a good day just by the number of completed assignments, the number of things you've checked off. Measure a good day by if your kids leave excited about what they're learning. A good day could include a significant question getting asked by one child that you spend the entire class period on. In fact, that might be the day during a school year that they remember for the rest of their life. Understanding a difficult idea, actually going back and revising work can be an outstanding school day, and you're teaching a number of things, but you're not checking off boxes. Watching kids learn how to work with each other, share with each other, and take advantage of a multi-age setting can be one of the best experiences you have as a teacher. Stopping all academic conversation and talking about life or a current event or something that's happening shows the kids what's really important. And you weigh those things out, and how you teach and how you live, being transparent with your kids in that way, that's going to be some of the best teaching experiences you have. Don't miss them just because you want to get to the next box. I know you know that. I know you've heard it. Now try to apply it. Okay, you've heard all the theory around Portals lesson plans. Now's the fun part. Let's put together what might look like a 40-minute lesson and walk through it. We're going to do it verbally here, but let's imagine a shared science lesson and how that might work and what it looks like. My favorite science lesson ever was putting bean seeds in a cup and growing them up. So let's think through that as a teacher. So I've got the read, think, do lesson plan in front of me with Portals. In the first 3 minutes of class, however, I have to gather the students and I have to connect. I have to make sure everybody's settled in. So what I would ask students to do is when we're ready to start classes, they would all have places they need to be. Could be desks, it could be beanbag chairs, it could be sitting in a circle on the floor. Depending on the age and what's appropriate, you want the kids to all be facing you and you want to have their attention. So what I would say is everything under your desk, right? Textbooks, pencils, widgets, everything under the desk, because I want to start together as a class before we do anything. This provides order. This gives a rhythm to the class where kids can feel like, okay, everything's going as normal today. And for 3 minutes, I might hold up a seed and ask the kids, like, okay, what does this seed need to become a plant? What are the things that are there? And I'm going to gather information from the kids, or what's called prior knowledge. What do they already know about seeds? And I'm going to start to, as a teacher, as I hear those answers, think about what are things I need to clarify? What are things that are going to be shown in the lesson? And I need to allow each student to offer ideas or thoughts about it. But I imagine this taking just a few minutes at the beginning of the class. And then I would introduce the lesson. For the next 10 minutes, we're going to read some material together that talks about seeds. And we're going to learn how seeds actually grow and some of the things. And you're going to see that a lot of your answers are actually in the reading. So when you see that, I'd like to just underline those things or highlight them. Younger students might listen to that reading and have example illustrations. I might have them stand up when they're learning something new and then sit down when they're learning things we already talked about. Older students might take notes while we do the reading, identify key terms, and add those notes to their portfolios later on, and start to map out a plan or a way in which they can test it. So I would spend, again, 3 minutes on an introduction or an anticipatory set, the next 10 minutes covering the reading material itself, and then during the next 10 minutes, I'd be moving into think. So bringing the class back together, ask them to narrate the process in order. Okay, let's review the reading. And that's usually the first question in your think column. It's a basic understanding question. What changes first? Why does the plant need water? What role does light play? How can it happen if there's a condition that's missing? What might happen to the plant? And then I would invite different levels of responses. So the first level, basic understanding, but then I would move on to other more complex kinds of questions. Usually the second or third question in your think column. How does this compare to other things? How did Jesus use the parable of the seed, et cetera, et cetera? I would connect to the rest of life. Do any of you have gardens? A founder level might arrange picture cards in a sequence of a seed growing into a plant. A grower might explain the process orally and do it scientifically using the right words. A thinker might compare germination with how plant growth happens in the wild. How is this affected when it's not curated? They might even think of experiments to test that. A leader may distinguish that observation or inference from a design or one way to test a variable, and they might be really excited about Bible class and want to develop an entire sermon or teaching that uses the parable of the seeds and what they've learned from science class. All of these conversations, these ideas, taking about 10 minutes is usually enough to get people excited or thinking about what they might do with the material. And then I would spend 15 to 20 minutes on do. Depending on how much time you have, I would contribute the larger part of my class to actually doing something with what we've read about. Now, seeds in small containers and plants, that's pretty easy. A few egg cartons, a little dirt from the backyard, and some seeds from the home and garden store. A younger student can be filling the containers and placing the seeds. Growers are labeling them and putting in initial observations on the conditions, using a thermometer and figuring out the room temperature. A thinker might help to establish some comparison models or doing a control test using different amounts of light with each of the egg cartons. And then a leader would record, present, make predictions, and organize a schedule for future observations. Or if you're doing multi-age learning, the leader can be orchestrating all of this for you while you go around the room having individual conversations. Always end the class with what's called closure. Bring the students back together. It's good if that back together looks exactly like the beginning of class. And you would ask them, what did we do today? What are we going to watch out for next? Identify when students are going to return, when they're going to observe seeds next. Connect the lesson to this idea of care and stewardship in God's creation, giving them one final thought as they leave the room. Another great way to do closure, even in 2 minutes, is just tell the class back what you've seen for the last hour. Here's what I noticed. Here's what I saw you doing. Here's what gets me excited as a teacher. Not only does that help you build the relationship with students, but you're modeling for them how to do think about it questions tomorrow because you're putting yourself under the same conditions that your students are being asked to do. You explain what you've observed, what you noticed, what connections you made, and in 2 minutes, you can really have them leaving with excitement for what's going to happen tomorrow in class. The entire class or the entire family sharing one central learning experience with flexible examples in the middle. Now, each student's participated. In fact, it's pretty hard to not participate in that kind of a classroom. And you've just done project-based learning for 40 minutes, or at least a model of it. Your lesson included an opening or an anticipatory set, reading content, think about it, which is your core assessment, and then actually doing something with what you've read about and learned. That's practical work. And then finally, closure, bringing it all together, summarizing and making clear what the purpose of the lesson was and why you did it. That's a Portals lesson plan in action. So there's been a lot on lesson planning. Let me give you some closing encouragements. You really can't mess this up. Students are flexible, they're adaptable, they're moldable. If you love them and you love learning, that's going to come through. There's no wrong way to do it as long as that you're doing it. So Portals lesson plans are designed to make excellent learning more accessible and sustainable for you. In other words, this is doable education, but it's also research-based best practice. This is actually the most effective way to do learning. So provide the readings, the questions, the resources, the practice, and the project ideas. That shapes your day, and this helps bring classrooms together and subjects together. You can teach multiple ages, and you can move beyond passive information gathering towards meaningful life work. That's the goal. And let me say this. You're not the end of the day. You're a steward. These aren't your kids. These are God's kids. And so God's going to see to their learning and their plan and their life. And you get to be a part of that. Remember, the plan's a framework, but there is a master planner here too. We do our best and we commit the rest. So you've put in everything you can do. You've given it the passion and the heart and the learning. You'll have good days and you will have bad days. But ultimately, God's doing a work as you work with kids.